Dirt 5 is one of the first games we had a chance to check out on the new generation of consoles, but only now have we been able to actually look at the game running on other platforms besides Xbox Series X. And in fact, that version itself has received several updates since we checked out the preview build. There's a lot to talk about though once we bring in these other consoles. Some weird stuff, some great stuff. It's a wild mix, and to discuss it, I wanted to bring in Richard Ledbetter.
John, I've been following this one as well. Really interesting looking product. A lot of great legacy tech here that's been updated for next gen. Really enjoyed playing it so far. I think the game hasn't quite had a fair shake from the media quite yet. Something that I think we need to address here.
Yeah, so this is the arcade racer we needed at launch. This is the only real one that we have, and this has elements from MotorStorm, Drive Club, Onrush. It's a lot of the same team members that worked on those games have worked on this one. But yeah, the initial videos that came out, there was some of them had capture issues, incorrect tone mapping, for instance, and also the game itself doesn't play that nicely with YouTube. And between that and the time of day that the first tracks start off with, it kind of leaves a bad first impression, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think the thing to point out here is that the engine that's being used here is fully dynamic. Basically anything can be changed, anything can be tweaked. You can have different weather, you can have different times of day. All of that can be changing dynamically, which is a strength for the engine. But what it does mean is that you can get some scenes that just don't look particularly great. And, typically I think people are almost spoiled by sort of artist-driven lighting, which, is literally designed to show the game in its best light. And sometimes in a dynamic presentation, as you see in Dirt 5, you don't get that kind of curated look, so to speak. But what you do get is some occasionally spectacular results that's kind of just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, precisely. And in this case, you can even do some cool things, like in arcade mode, you can change the time of day progression speed to a ridiculously high speed. So it basically cycles through an entire 24 hours within the course of a single race. And just seeing the shadows crawl along the terrain as you race, and the sun going up and down, and it's kind of cool. So I like that stuff. It's a cool looking game, and it's a lot of fun to play. But today we're here to talk about the various console versions. Specifically, because there's so many and they all have so many modes, we're doing just next gen. So that means PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and Series S. The first thing I want to get out of the way here in regards to the capture here is there's a current, maybe a bug, or there's something going on with the way that tone mapping works in SDR on this game. So the PS5 capture will appear darker than Xbox, and that means some shadow detail is crushed. It can look a little bit better due to the higher contrast, but you're actually missing some detail. This is not an issue when playing in HDR. It looks great in HDR on all the machines, but yeah, if you're playing in standard dynamic range, it's going to be a little darker on PS5. So when you see the comparisons, that's why.
Okay, fair enough, yeah. I mean, I believe that the developer is aware of this and is looking into the issues as to why it happens. But yeah, it's kind of curious that I don't think the PlayStation 5 version is looking quite correct here, but there are instances where the kind of extra contrast you get kind of makes it look a little bit better in some scenarios. Kind of weird.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a weird thing. But yeah, I guess that's what happens though when you have to build a game for a console launch that also runs on like 9 different machines. So I have a little bit of sympathy for what the developers went through to get this ready. It's a ton of work, I can imagine. But yeah, so some people have been confused by the options menu because you pop this open on any of these consoles and you basically have this image quality mode, like a resolution mode, and a performance mode. And it's like, what the heck do these do? I mean, you'd think the first two would be both focused on, like the quality of the image, right? And usually when referring to resolution, we say image quality. So what does this mean? So I'm going to start by going through each of the 3 modes. We're going to discuss what they do, and I'm going to discuss how they impact each console. So let's start with the image quality mode. To put it simply, this one is focused on boosting overall world detail. That means you get higher resolution shadows, you get ambient occlusion, which can be really seen here during this introduction scene where You get nice ambient shading under the wheel well and around the grille on this car that's absent in the resolution mode and the frame rate mode. In the draw distance and level of detail, everything's just boosted up a little bit. So in terms of just raw visual assets, this is the best looking mode. But, so, PS5 and Xbox Series X, resolution-wise. All versions, by the way, use dynamic resolution scaling and temporal reprojection, which they discussed in the Onrush video I did back then. And they target 4K in this mode, but it is very much dynamic with sort of like, it seems like it can sort of vary between roughly 1440p up to 4K, and it just kind of depends on how much stuff is on screen, right?
Right.
And also, Xbox Series S then technically tops out at 1440p, but really, in terms of what you see during the race, it's more in like the 1080p or below 1080p range. So yeah, it kind of scales down as you would expect based on the difference in the hardware. So really nothing surprising yet. But when looking at these side by sides, the first thing I did notice is actually, for some reason, the PS5 version gets slightly better texture filtering. So that seems to be different between them. And also, in these side-by-sides during the introductions for races, the average resolution is a little bit higher on PS5. Again, it's a very strange thing. I'm not sure what's going on there, but that's what the data is showing us.
Okay.
So that's what we have now. So that's image quality mode. It's good on all platforms, but there are some very odd differences there. Then we come to resolution mode, and this is obviously then focused on pushing the highest pixel count, which is, again, 4K on Series X and PS5, and more so than the other mode, this actually does stick to that or near it a lot more often. So it is the sharpest option you can use, and it does look really crisp and nice during gameplay. Whereas with Series S, again, looking at my counts here, it's mostly like in the 1080p-ish range for some reason. So it is definitely scaled back. Presumably it can go higher. I didn't spot that often enough to say that it does.
Right, got it. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there is a big discussion at the moment about Series S and just how it is going to scale. But, you know, the 1440p target that Microsoft was talking about does seem to be somewhat optimistic based on what we're seeing so far. And I'm fine with that because, you know, there are not so many 1440p native screens out there. If 1080p is the target, so be it. But I just think the marketing from Microsoft needs to be a bit clearer about that.
I can agree with that. And, you know, along those same lines, I actually tested the game on a 1080p plasma from Pioneer, and the Series S is actually a great match for a display like that. It really looks good on there. And you get that nice 1-to-1 pixel mapping. So it's a good machine for a lower resolution display, and I think that's always kind of what it was targeting in a way. So, but yeah, that's where we're at with that. I will say the detail level, as you would expect, is slightly pared back compared to image quality mode. You know, AO is reduced, shadows are slightly reduced, things like that, but it still looks good. But it's also worth noting that there are some additional cuts as well in this mode on Series S. Namely, things like grass and various other trackside detail are pulled in a little bit on this system compared to Series X and PS5. So are we clear so far then, Rich? Because there's the thing, it's about to get weirder.
Okie doke. Go for it.
All right. So this is the one I do not understand what's going on here. So in frame rate mode, the game switches to a 120 hertz mode. And that means you get a reduction in resolution and detail. Makes perfect sense, right?
Of course.
On Series X and PS5, this is hard to say for sure because we don't have an HDMI 2.1 capture device, so I can only capture at 1080p 120. And because it's dynamic, it's hard to like pinpoint it with system level screenshots. But it seems to be somewhere between 900p and 1440p on average.
Okay.
Again, can't say for certain, but that seems to be what we've got. And it actually looks pretty good in motion due to the temporal reprojection. Now, Xbox Series S, that one takes a much bigger hit, and I count it as low as like the 600p, 576p range in really bad situations, and it can go up from there. But it is, much lower resolution, which when you look at what the Series X and PS5 are doing, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so if you really want the high frame rate, you do have to sacrifice some resolution, and it's still worth it in some ways, I think.
Right. Okay.
But here's the weird part. Maybe this is a bug. I don't know what's going on. It doesn't make sense logically for it to be like this, but basically the detail level on PS5 is significantly higher than on both Xbox systems. Basically, it looks like the PS5 version is just using the same detail settings from resolution mode, whereas the Xbox systems are using a mode where the car LODs take a significant hit, like during the introduction scene. Even if you're just on a time trial with one car, you can see here it's missing a lot of detail on the car. The road tessellation, or the detail on the road, that's completely gone. So all the little pebbles and geometric detail, that's missing. The grass is pared way back. There's also a reduction in overall geometry in the environment, and of course texture filtering is much lower quality. So, I mean, you've seen the shots. I'm a little bit puzzled by this. What do you think?
It does say bug, really, doesn't it? I mean, here's the thing. When we were looking at Dirt 5 during the preview period, patches were coming in thick and fast, and there were things being broken as well as being fixed. And, kind of weird stuff going on there. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking maybe... I mean, Microsoft has got this unified development environment now where basically they're looking to standardize PC, Xbox One and the Xbox Series consoles under one umbrella, and I'm kind of wondering whether settings from one set of consoles are being erroneously attached to another. I mean, we saw that quite a lot with Xbox One and Xbox One X, so I'm kind of curious as to what's going on there, but it's certainly not what the developer intended, I don't think. And I would expect this stuff to be corrected. I think one thing we do need to remember is first of all, next gen stuff is coming in hot. You know, developers have had very limited time with the development environments, and secondly, you know, this is the COVID age, unfortunately, and this does mean that time pressures are kind of even more amplified. So, you know, we're going to have to accept that things aren't going to be absolutely 100% polished on day one. But I'm pretty confident that the developer will be taking a close look at this. And as usual, whenever there is any sort of contentious finding with our comparisons and whatnot, I always do make sure that the developer is briefed. So none of the stuff that we're seeing here will come as a surprise to the developer. And I've been told they are looking into it.
Excellent news. And I think you're spot on, especially with, you know, it's a difficult year, and hitting launch for any system is difficult. And, you know, just getting into these new tools and working on these new dev kits, it can be difficult to extract all the performance you'd like from them right away. So I don't think we can take anything away from any of these initial launch comparisons. That's really important to note when looking at these games.
I mean, in an ideal world, that, you know, we would be waiting for patched updates to come through. But the bottom line is, this is the retail code experience as it is now, and we're covering it because, you know, this information's got to get out there. But, you know, there have been some really positive responses to some of our stuff. So, you know, we made a big deal about the 120 hertz bug in Devil May Cry 5 on PlayStation 5. That has now been fixed. So, you know, it is just a case, I think, of giving developers time.
Exactly. So, and I have every confidence that this game can also be fixed based on their response in the past. I think they will take care of it. But that then brings us on to performance. And when we discuss 120, actually, there is an interesting benefit to running in lower detail, as you'll see. But let's start with the IQ mode. And again, so this one targets 60 frames per second, and both Xbox Series X and PS5 deliver just that most of the time. But as you can see from the graph, during these initial sections when all the cars are clumped together, there is some slowdown. On this track, the PS5 has an ever so slight advantage, but by and large, they're very close, and it's not something to worry about as far as I'm concerned. And also, if you have a variable refresh rate display and you're using the Xbox, it completely solves this, and it looks flawless to the eye. So I would like to see that cleaned up a little bit. I guess the weird thing is that on PS5, the way tearing works is different, where it seems to you get a torn frame followed by duplicate frames. So in reality, while the Xbox is dropping a little bit more and has a more tearing, it's actually slightly less distracting when it happens due to the way that it works. So that is something to consider.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, the tearing situation there, it is basically just on the very top of the screen on PlayStation 5, right? So it basically presents just as a VSync game would, really. So I'm kind of curious as to why the tearing is in there at all. You're still getting all of the negative elements of VSync, which is the judder, but obviously the tearing isn't really noticeable.
So talking with some people on Twitter, though, it does seem that in the early days, right after this game released, the tearing was quite rampant on PS5, and it has since been patched. I haven't tested this personally, but it sounds like they may have simply adjusted the way VSync works, or the way that their adaptive tearing works to solve those issues. So maybe it's related to that. Now, Xbox Series S, I guess predictably, it's the slowest of the bunch. So I'm comparing it here with Xbox Series X, and yeah, on average, it's a little bit lower than the Series X. But again, by and large, it's not bad. And if you have a VRR display, again, it takes care of all these issues. So this is iQube mode then. It's okay. It's mostly stable 60, but you're definitely going to get some dips in the large packs. If you want a very stable 60 FPS by and large, though, resolution mode is the way to go. All three consoles do the best in this mode in terms of hitting the consistent 60 FPS. It's almost just a perfect line, with occasional dips and tears here and there in certain situations. And because of the dynamic nature of this game, obviously it's not possible to test every permutation. And like certain tracks, like if you race a full grid at night in the rain and you're just going around a certain corner and all the stuff's going off, you might get some slowdown. But by and large, you get a nice 60. And Series S is, I guess, the slowest once again here. But it's not bad.
Got it.
So that's kind of the. This is all fairly typical stuff. It is interesting to see again, but again, I don't think we can take anything away from performance right now. That's just what this game is running at the moment, and it's pretty good all around. The 120 mode, though, this one is troublesome. So maybe you can explain some of the issues that we faced in measuring this.
Okay. Well, if a game runs with VSync, for example, like Devil May Cry, no problem whatsoever. We can measure that quite accurately. However, if a game uses tearing, adaptive sync, that is problematic because essentially frame times will be varying above and below 8.3 milliseconds. And when it's below 8.3 milliseconds, the game is actually running momentarily faster than 120 frames per second. And because we can only sample the video output at 120 frames per second, tracking those tears is extremely problematic, and we're going to have to take a closer look at that. But in an ideal world, well, tearing at 120 hertz really isn't great. But I guess it gives a slightly smoother presentation overall than the alternative, which is to VSync at 120 frames per second.
Which is an important thing to note, because in the pre-release state, the Xbox version, when Tom looked at it, actually seemed to use VSync in the 120 mode.
Yeah.
But it showed more dips, whereas now, because of the lack of VSync, or the way they handle it, you don't actually get any sort of noticeable judder. It feels very, very smooth. Mm-hmm. Especially on a VRR display, it looks perfect on the Xbox. The S, I think, fares a little worse again, but it's not that bad. So I couldn't measure those because of the way that they're handling tearing. PS5 was also difficult, but because of the way that they present each frame, with the combination of torn frame followed by a duplicate frame when it misses its frame time, I was actually able to go through and manually correct any errors that showed up in this, so we can get a little bit of a peek at how it runs. And by and large, actually, and this applies to all of them, 120 hertz mode is really, really smooth, but there's certain tracks, and weirdly enough, the very first event in the game, the PS5 version just doesn't like it. And you can see that in this initial grid here, the frame rate really struggles to hit the 120 target. And this is an example of a mode that runs significantly better on Xbox in this. And that's why I mentioned before that maybe the slightly lower detail levels on that version actually pay off in terms of maintaining fluidity. Because on PS5, it does look better, but in cases like this, you don't have VRR as a fallback, so you're just dealing with judder and tearing at the same time.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the 120 mode on PS5 doesn't feel quite as nice to play overall, but only when you hit tracks like this. Normally, it's fine. I'd say like 90% okay, but sometimes these events, there's just the right combination of things happening, and the system doesn't like it. You get these kind of performance dips. So it's kind of a weird one, I think, overall.
Yeah, I mean, something I'd like to point out, and it's kind of difficult to express it, but, well, you will see a lot more variation in 120 hertz modes. And yeah, something to point out is, well, let's say the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, well, it's 30 frames per second, but the difference between 90 and 120, it may well still be 30 frames per second, but it's very, very different because the frame times are much more compressed at higher frame rates. So you can't really compare the difference between 90 to 120 to 30 to 60, even though both the difference is 30 frames per second. The actual feeling is very, very different. So this is something I think we might have to work on in terms of presentation, because, you know, it's not comparable, and yet the graph says it is. Frame time really is important here, but it's kind of difficult to express that as well. So yeah, something we're going to have to think about there, especially when we've got VSync, no VSync, VRR. I think VRR is just so important because, you know, basically it puts the console in charge of when you get a new frame on your screen. It does away with screen tear. It does away with judder. And yeah, the fact that Xbox has it really does, and the fact that it's here on Xbox, it really does do favours for titles like this and Assassin's Creed. And the fact that PS5 doesn't have it, you've got to contend with tearing and judder. So yeah, this is kind of like a very forward-looking feature. Not many people will have screens that have it at the moment, which is a bit of a shame. But, you know, a couple of years down the road, I hope to see it standard. And it really does a fantastic job of kind of leveling out all of these performance issues at high frame rates especially.
Yeah, I think so too. We just have to make sure that games don't lean too heavily on the requirement of VRR because, you know, like you said, most people don't have those displays yet, and their performance experience is definitely important. But hopefully, more and more people will have VR displays going forward, and this will eventually become a non-issue. But we're going to have to wait and see on that. But ultimately, that's kind of where we're at right now. It's an interesting one. There's some differences between the different versions that we've discussed, but none of it's cut and dry. And I think with games like this, it's really best to just consider how many different platforms they're shipping on. Just the short amount of time they had to get everything out the door. It definitely just highlights how difficult it is to ship this stuff. And
yeah,
I think they will continue to work on it. Like you said, the Xbox version had several major patches up through the preview phase, including some that would break something like the camera system entirely, and then the next patch it's fixed, and you can see that they were really down to the wire. But even still, even with these little issues here and there, I think it's a really fun little arcade game. And honestly, while they each have their own limitations, I think all versions that I've tested here are definitely worth playing. So if you do want an arcade racer, definitely do check out Dirt 5.
Yeah, there's nothing like it at launch on any of the consoles, really.
No.
So this is kind of a unique proposition, definitely.
I agree. And there's a lot here, so give it a shot. But I think that's going to do it for now. So thanks for letting me vent about my different findings, Rich.
Well, thanks for working through a total of 9 different quality modes.
Yes.
It's not easy.
Not at all, not at all. But if you guys enjoyed this, do let us know. And, you know, all the good stuff. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell. You know the drill. And, of course, come find us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.